Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing some important international security questions with our special guest on the Bugajski hot seat, Luke Coffey, Director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy, the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Subverting NATO from Within. Unable to prevent NATO enlargement, Moscow is intensifying its campaign to subvert alliance members from within. President Putin views NATO as the main threat to Russia's expansionism and calculates that soft power sabotage is more effective to undermine Western unity than a military confrontation that would expose Russia's weaknesses. The Kremlin has threatened numerous states against joining NATO, fearing that this enhances America's military presence in defending Europe. Although its obstruction has largely failed, Moscow also pursues a parallel strategy to neutralize allied governments once they join NATO. It deploys a broad arsenal of sub-military disruption and disinformation to impact on the policies of national leaders. For Putin, there are three categories of NATO members: the vulnerable, the exploitable, and the resistors. The vulnerable states are small countries bordering Russia or new members that are susceptible to pressure, including the Western Balkans. Although failing to prevent Montenegro's accession by using Serbian nationalists to overthrow its government, Moscow continues to support the anti-NATO opposition. It also failed to obstruct North Macedonia's NATO entry, but continues to incite nationalist extremists. The exploitable states are mostly West European countries that are penetrated through business, media, or corruption. Germany, France, and Italy serve as classic examples, where a former Chancellor, Gerhard Schroeder, the leader of a major opposition party, Marine Le Pen, and a former Deputy Prime Minister, Matteo Salvini, have been recruited to serve Kremlin interests. Moscow's penetration reaches deep into the political elites. Some recent NATO members, including Hungary and Bulgaria, are also exploitable. Croatia has become a Kremlin target to curtail the development of energy projects that challenge Russia's monopolistic ambitions in regional gas supplies. Zagreb is also useful for Moscow in keeping Bosnia-Herzegovina off balance by raising demands for a Croatian entity that mirror Serbian pressures on the fragile country. The third category of states are the resistors, which are more impermeable to Russia's manipulation. Poland and Romania are the two key examples, where politicians across the political spectrum have no illusions about Moscow's neo-imperialism. They value NATO as an essential security structure that guarantees their independence. Moscow has tried to isolate both countries on the international arena by portraying them as perpetual anti-Russian troublemakers. Putin is escalating his campaign to weaken NATO in order to pursue his attacks on Ukraine, to divide Georgia and Moldova, and to annex Belarus. In reaction, the alliance must be better prepared to combat Moscow's infiltration, especially by prosecuting state-sponsored corruption and countering disinformation. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with our special guest, Luke Coffey from the Heritage Foundation. In fact, let me give you Luke's exact position. He's director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy, Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. It's one of the longest affiliations I know of. Let me just say, he's at the Heritage Foundation, which is one of the major policy institutes here in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Luke. Thanks for joining me on the show.
It's my pleasure to be back.
We've had quite a volatile start, I would say, to 2020, particularly with this potential, what looked like a potential war between America and Iran. There's a standoff at the moment. Nothing is certain, nothing can be excluded. Can you explain how we've reached this point? In other words, for our viewers, why is it that America, particularly now under the Trump administration, is so, let's say, confronted with Iran as a major regional problem?
Yeah, I agree with you. We're only a few days into 2020, and if the rest of the year is going to be anything like this first week or so, then we have a long ride ahead of us. It's also a leap year, so we get an extra day of all of this. If you look back over the past 12 months at Iran's behavior in the region, I think the Trump administration has shown a lot of restraint, actually. If you look at the attack on the international oil tankers in the Gulf back early last summer, there was no U.S. response, a military response at least. If you look back at the downing of a U.S. drone over international airspace, there was no U.S. military response, even though the president said he called one off at the last minute. And often I'm told, well, it's just a drone. There was no pilot. Well, this drone cost $180 million, right? So it's not just any old drone that was shot down by the Iranians. And then you look at the attack on the Aramco site in Saudi Arabia, the oil facility in eastern Saudi Arabia, that the strike that originated from Iran caused a huge chunk of Saudi Arabia's oil production to go offline temporarily. And again, no response. So I think you had some U.S. partners in the region wondering if Donald Trump is going to stand up to Iran. But of course, President Trump at the time wanted to leave that door open for negotiations, and that was his main focus, was getting the Iranians back to the table. Well, a few weeks ago, when the U.S. contractor was killed in Iraq as a result of Iranian-backed militia, I think that crossed one of President Trump's red lines, which was a death of a U.S. citizen in this conflict. And of course, the U.S. hit back with airstrikes against that militia group, and then the Iranian-backed militias besieged the U.S. embassy, and now Qasem Soleimani is dead. So I think that's kind of how we got to where this point is today. I believe that President Trump wanted to keep the door open for negotiations. I believe that he was probably presented this option to take out Qasem Soleimani in the past and refused to do so. And it was only because of all the events leading up to this point that he decided to greenlight this operation.
Explain also to our viewers the importance of the Middle East, because America used to be much more dependent on Middle Eastern oil. I don't think we're dependent anymore. I think we're basically energy self-sufficient to a large extent with the development of shale oil, shale gas and so forth. But why is the Middle East still so important in terms of our national security?
That's a very good point about the oil and gas. Because of advancements in technology and the shale gas revolution, the U.S. is not dependent really at all on Middle East oil. But there are still many countries in the world that are, including important countries to the United States, like Japan, South Korea. The huge chunk of Japan's natural gas passes through the Strait of Hormuz. So imagine the impact to the global economy and the U.S. economy if that steady stream of natural gas was disrupted to Tokyo. The economic implications in what is a very interdependent world would be felt by everyone, not just by those in Japan. So that's why the U.S. still has an interest in making sure that there's a free flow of international shipping in the region. And also the U.S. has a historical legacy in the Middle East with key partners and friends that drive our interests there today.
Key ally Israel, of course.
Yeah, Israel, but also we shouldn't discount the Gulf states as well in this mix. And then you have the threats of transnational terrorism that that originate from this region of the world, and the U.S. has an interest here. Now, in terms of Iran, is very much focused on the nuclear side of things and their export of terrorism and instability around the region. Iran is a signatory of the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. They should not be trying to seek a nuclear weapon. If they do ever get a nuclear weapon, it would mean the end of the NPT probably, and it would be hugely destabilizing in the region because it would probably spark a regional arms race. And the last thing that we should want is an arms race.
A nuclear arms race.
A nuclear arms race in one of the most dangerous regions of the world.
In other words, Saudi Arabia and Turkey presumably would wish to acquire nuclear weapons at this point.
And Egypt, I would say as well, into that mix. So This would be very dangerous for obvious reasons, and Iran seems to be focused on not only its nuclear weapons program, but exporting the revolution. In the Iranian constitution, there is a requirement to export the revolution, to continue the revolution, the Islamic revolution in other places in the Middle East. And that's why we see what we see in places like Syria, the instability in the Gulf region, using Shia minority groups to subvert state institutions in Yemen, in Iraq. And of course, at the tip of the spear of all of this was Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Quds forces, and the Quds forces were the forces that were kind of responsible for these overseas military operations.
And of course, there's the Russian dimension as well. Iran is one of the key allies of Russia in the Middle East.
That's absolutely right, and it's paradoxical in a sense, because if you look at the history between the two empires, the Russian Empire and the Persian Empire, they were constantly at each other's throats in the region, for sure. But now Iran has become a client state of Russia. Iran depends on Russia's goodwill at the UN for protection at the UN Security Council, also diplomatic protection on the international stage. Russia helps Iran get around sanctions, or at least alleviate the pressure that are created by international sanctions. But I'm wondering if Russia is getting sort of tired of this, or if it's wearing thin, because Russia has so many commitments in other places. Its relationship with Iran could be increasingly becoming a burden. And if you look at the Russian response at the downing of the Ukrainian airliner, they said that they should, learn from this, and they should be open about this, which is ironic considering the fate of the Malaysian airliner that was shot down by Russian-backed forces in eastern Ukraine in 2014.
Right. Russia, of course, is one of the few countries, if not the only country, that sells Iran sophisticated weaponry, including the air defense S-400 system.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for Russia, I think, also instability means higher oil prices, which is also good for the Russian economy, but they've got to balance that with other commitments that they would have to incur.
That's absolutely right, and they also see Iran as a way to make life more frustrating or more difficult for the U.S. So in that sense, Iran is very useful for Russia. But as we've seen in places like Syria, and also we've seen in the larger geopolitical picture with Iran and the economic sanctions, Russia is carrying a heavy burden to continue providing this top cover for Iran.
Right. Let's go back to U.S. policy. One of the major appeals of Trump during the election campaign, particularly to his base, was that he would extricate the United States from the so-called endless or perpetual foreign wars, including, of course, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and so forth. On the other hand, he cannot be seen to be simply withdrawing, evacuating, surrendering territory, if you like, surrendering a region to an adversary such as Iran. So what do you make of the Trump doctrine here? How does he balance helping all the things you said are very important for our national security with the fact that he's promised his electorate that he's not going to involve America in other wars?
Well, of course, this is a very popular message from President Trump to most American people. I think your average American has no appetite whatsoever for further military interventions in the Middle East. But we also have to understand the U.S. has certain interests in the Middle East, and the enemy also gets a vote in all of this. Just because we say a war is over and we're coming home, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is over. President Trump's instincts are for negotiations and deal making. He thinks he's this great deal maker from his business time. Whether or not that's true is a matter of great debate, but that's how he views himself. And so his first instincts with Iran are to get a better deal than Obama, as he would put it, on the nuclear side of things, and to leave the door open for those negotiations. This is a president that doesn't like U.S. troops in Afghanistan. This is a president that doesn't like U.S. troops in Syria. This is a president that can barely tolerate U.S. troops in Germany. So the idea or Korea. So the idea that during an election year, the president's going to launch some sort of Operation Persian Freedom and conduct a large-scale ground invasion of Iran, I think is very far-fetched indeed. But as Americans, we tend to view the world as being very black or white. It's either engagement or isolationism. It's either intervention or withdrawal.
Right.
There's a huge policy space between doing nothing at all and invading Iran. And for Qasem Soleimani, in between that was his demise.
Well, it seems to me that Trump considers himself the key diplomat, but with what level of success? I mean, North Korea, I think, is a very good example with this breakthrough of summits with Kim Jong-un. All sorts of things seem to be promised, but North Korea continues to develop its ballistic missiles, its nuclear weapons program.
Yeah, on the diplomatic front, there have not been many successes like this for President Trump in terms of unlocking these big problems, these big geopolitical problems. But at least he remains committed to pursuing this negotiated track. Whereas most Republican presidents in the past, the idea of putting talks first or keeping the door open without preconditions to regimes like Iran, or even what we see in Afghanistan with the negotiations with the Taliban, would have been unheard of. But because President Trump is so unconventional, he's able to do so.
It's almost a paradox, though, isn't it, Luke, that his language is not very diplomatic, and yet he's more willing to continue talks with the very people that we would not talk to.
That's one of many paradoxes with the Trump administration, I think, yes.
I mean, if you look at his tweets and so forth and the threats he issues before reaching out a hand, it's quite remarkable.
Well, that's his style, isn't it? To ruffle feathers, get people talking. You have to wonder if some of this is theatrics. And for us in the policy world, we're not used to this sort of thing. But for President Trump, who's been in the business world and also the Hollywood TV world,
entertainment
world, this is just part of the publicity.
So the Trump entertainment doctrine, or the Trump theatrics doctrine.
Yes, well, it's definitely theatrics on Twitter, and let's see how it plays out. We need to keep an eye on how these tweets and this rhetoric translates into policy.
Right.
That's the crucial part.
Exactly. Let's turn a little bit to domestic developments. We're in the middle of this whole impeachment process. Basically, I think what it's going to boil down to, the House is impeached and the Senate will acquit.
Yeah.
So what is that going to mean? And plus in the middle of an election campaign, which is really beginning to kick off in February, particularly on the Democrat side, with the primaries coming up. So what does all this mean for the potential re-election of Trump? Does this actually strengthen him or weaken him domestically?
Well, actually, I don't think it plays, it's not going to play a major role at all by the time we get to November. This is because America's so divided and so polarized that Trump's supporters think that he's the best president since Abraham Lincoln, and Trump's opponents think that everything he does is a constitutional crisis, when the reality is somewhere in between. But these people have already made up their minds. So the people who can be changed, who don't follow politics very closely, who hear about impeachment but they really don't understand what's going on, these people are going to vote on the bread and butter issues of the economy, jobs, education, healthcare, the environment. These are the issues that people are going to vote on. So I think that it's going to be a very tight race. I'm not willing to make any predictions because all predictions in the past seem to have been incorrect. And but I wouldn't say that Trump definitely has, he'll definitely win. I think it's going to be closer than that.
Also depends on who the Democrats nominate as his opponent.
That's absolutely true. If they go very far to the left, then he probably will win because America's not in that space. But if they pick someone who can get some of that middle ground, then I think that they stand a better chance at beating President Trump. The challenge for the Democrats will be to get back basically white working class Democrats that used to vote Democrat, mainly because of connections to trade labor unions and this sort of thing, to get those back in the Rust Belt because President Trump took those votes, and in places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, these were places that decided the electoral outcome in 2016. You could read, there are reports out there that show that if 100,000 people in certain counties in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan change the way they vote,
Right.
Trump would have lost.
Right.
So
70-something thousand, I think.
yeah,
was
so
the total. Yeah.
that's going to be the challenge
Right.
for President Trump. Is he going to be able to deliver on all these promises he's made to this certain demographic? And it remains to be seen if they've felt the benefits yet.
Well, this is precisely the area where a lot of jobs were lost because of outsourcing, American companies trying to find cheaper labor in other parts of the world. Have these jobs come back?
Well, certainly not in the manufacturing sense. Right. I grew up in very rural Missouri myself, and I come from a family, I'm the first male in 3 generations not to work at a Chrysler factory, in fact. And that car factory where my father worked and my grandfather worked is now closed. It closed during the last economic recession, and it's an empty field. So it's a daily reminder for people who live in that region about the impact of the loss of manufacturing and these jobs. But the question is, has President Trump delivered for the people who are disgruntled or disenchanted? And I think that remains to be seen.
Yeah, and I remember in those states there's a large Central East European voting constituency.
Well, where I grew up outside St. Louis has a very large Bosnian community. Chicago in the Midwest has a very large Polish American community. Yeah, and Pennsylvania has a very large Ukrainian American community.
Which, of course, they'll be presumably watching quite
very
closely in terms of this whole impeachment debate. But also, I would say, on the other hand, the paradox, I can't imagine many people with family with origins from Central Eastern Europe voting for a self-proclaimed socialist.
Yeah, well, that's very true. That's very true. And in American politics, like most politics in the democratic Western world, it's not clean cut.
No, I'm not talking about Trump as the socialist. I'm talking about Bernie Sanders.
No, that's what I agree. I mean, they're not going to sign up for this this new brand of neo-Marxism that's been sugar-coated by the term socialism at all. So it will be interesting to see how these these diaspora groups or these naturalized U.S. citizens that immigrated over here, how they vote and all of this too. It's going to be, there's a lot up in the air right now, and it's going to be a very close election, I think.
We're going to be coming back to this over the next year. Let's turn back, look to foreign policy. I think one of the things that's often forgotten, because it is a very polarized, politically polarized and socially polarized situation that we have now in the United States. However, there's always been, and it continues to be, bipartisan consensus in Congress on a couple of key questions, national security questions. NATO, for instance. I mean, there is overwhelming bipartisan support for strengthening NATO. I know there was an outcry both among Republicans and Democrats when Trump was criticizing or suggesting that NATO was somehow obsolete. Do you see this consensus continuing over the next election cycle if Trump is re-elected and so forth?
I do, because this consensus runs so deeply in the U.S. Body politic. I think if you look at Congress as a better representation of the mood of the people than whoever is in the White House in many ways, because obviously there are more members of Congress, they come from different parts of the country, and they share, and you're right, they share this sense of support for NATO, this suspicion or concern against countries like Russia. And I don't see this changing all that much. Even the Trump administration on NATO, even with all of Trump's rhetoric about Europeans not spending enough on defense, this administration has increased the amount of money it spends on defense in Europe. President Trump signed the accessions protocol for both Montenegro and for North Macedonia, taking on these new members, even though with some parts of his party this was not very popular. There's a certain fringe part of the Republican Party that's against this sort of enlargement.
The Rand Paul,
Mike Lee, Rand Paul, the Tucker Carlson, who's a big commentator in the United States.
Who's actually very much opposed to any involvement vis-a-vis Iran, I remember.
Yes, that's right, yeah. So there is a broad consensus about U.S. support for NATO and our transatlantic relationship. So I think that's, that's important, and I don't think that's going away anytime soon.
Also strengthening, when you say strengthening NATO, strengthening the enhanced forward presence,
yeah,
including the presence of American forces in places like Poland in
yes,
particular.
absolutely. And there's been huge advancements with that. We need to look beyond, though, just the security dimension of the U.S., of the transatlantic relationship between the U.S. and our European partners. We need to explore ways to deepen our economic cooperation, free trade. We need to make sure that this is kept on track as well. Because it's all very well to do the right things in terms of military spending, U.S. increasing its presence in Eastern Europe. But there's also certain aspects of that transatlantic relationship that need taking care of as well. Some of it's more symbolic, the way we talk about some of our partners in the region, the way we interact with them. This stuff matters.
Right. Well, Trump has actually been more critical of the West Europeans than the Central East Europeans. If you look at what he said about Germany compared to what he said about Poland or the Baltic
Yeah,
states.
that's very true. And I think that that's probably why he enjoys a certain level of popularity in Central and Eastern Europe. Even with all the Russia stuff hanging around town about collusion and the impeachment and the issue with Ukraine, I think when you look at the policies that are coming out of this administration, they've proven to be very good against Russia and very supportive of NATO.
I want to come back to the region in a moment. I want to ask a couple more questions about Congress. There has been and there is continuing bipartisan consensus on Russia. In other words, that Russia, as Mitt Romney famously said during the campaign with Obama, that Russia is our chief adversary, which was proven correct. Do you see this consensus diminishing if Trump does get a second term? Because let's face it, Trump has been pretty, let's say, accommodating vis-a-vis Putin. He's gone out of his way not to criticize the Russian president. His national security team, I think, is much more realistic in terms of what Russia's up to. But do you see do you see the possibility that he feel he has a freer hand in a second term?
Well, it depends on also what the makeup of Congress is, and if Congress still wants to take a tough line on Russia, we're a country of checks and balances and of institutions. And one thing that's unique about the U.S. democracy compared to many of the parliamentary democracies in Europe is the foreign policy role that our legislative branch has. So even if Trump wants to take a softer line on Russia, he will be constrained by Congress in many ways, not in every way, but in many ways. And I think this comes back to Trump's desire for dialogue and negotiations and talks. He wants to leave the door open, say nice things, flatter the other person. Like some of the stuff he says about Kim Jong-un is, I mean, absolutely absurd, right? All this flowery language about, great leader and young man.
But on the other hand,
talented.
he's also Rocket Man. He's criticized him. He's never done that to Putin. He's said nice things about Putin. He's never said bad things about Putin.
But you notice when President Trump responds to Kim Jong-un in that manner, it's because of some crazy statement that's put out from Pyongyang personally attacking President Trump, saying he's geriatric man with dementia.
I have no problem with him criticizing Kim Jong-un, but why doesn't he criticize Trump?
Because Putin.
Putin.
Probably because Putin doesn't personally criticize Trump. That's what triggers.
The Duma does. But
that's what. Yeah, but that's what triggers Trump to act in that way, right? It's very childish. We all agree, but that's still the way. That's how President Trump operates. He takes these things very personally. So if Putin doesn't personally attack President Trump, then he's not going to get attacked from. He's not going to get attacked back from the White House.
Right. He doesn't seem to make many comments. There's frequent incidents of Russian either fighter planes or naval vehicles approaching American, in a dangerous way, approaching American vehicles. It recently happened in the Black Sea. There doesn't seem to be any response from the highest levels in the White House.
No, you don't hear the U.S. respond about these things at that very senior level. I'm not sure why that is. I think part of it could be there's so much other stuff happening in the U.S., especially with impeachment and the politics and the campaigning, that actually the president is not paying that close attention to some of these issues. He's delegating this down to his national security team.
Right.
But if you look at when push comes to shove, whenever those Russian mercenaries were approaching Al-Tanf, that U.S. base in Syria, and they got within the security perimeter, the U.S. took them out. So I think that again, I like to look beyond what the tweets are and beyond the rhetoric and see what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, I mean, do you see the possibility that Putin will get a state visit to the White House? We keep hearing
Well, I
this
hope not.
season.
I think this would be a disaster. And also this idea that Russia should be brought back into the G8.
Yeah.
I think that nothing has been done by Russia to demonstrate goodwill that they should be allowed to do this.
Quite the opposite.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, look at everything Russia's done since it annexed Crimea, and there's been no indication whatsoever that Russia's ready to behave as a responsible member of the international community, especially especially as a member of the G8.
Exactly. Well, actually, this brings us back nicely to the U.S. election campaign. As we know, all our intelligence services overwhelmingly concluded that Russia interfered in our elections, whatever the purpose, in 2016. There is this disinformation that Moscow itself is spreading that was actually Ukraine that interfered. You've written about this,
Yes,
I know. Could you explain to us why is it that some people, particularly, I'm shocked actually that some senior Republicans would believe this? Russian disinformation, a party that's been so resolutely realistic, I would say, on defending America from the Russian threat. Why is this?
It is concerning. There are a number of reasons I think explain this, but in my opinion, none of it justifies it. I think if you wanted to explain it, you have a bunch of senior Republicans who have over the past few years have grown very close to President Trump and even aligned with him on many issues. And because the impeachment issue has become such a partisan issue, they feel obligated to defend the president against these partisan attacks from the Democrats. And on top of this, they actually know very little about Russian hybrid warfare, Russian disinformation, what's happening in Ukraine. And also, to cap it all off, Russia's very good at disinformation. So you combine all this together, you have these very senior Republican officials basically sharing conspiracy theories with the general public.
Yeah.
And those in the policy community, and also those in the on the Republican side who work on these issues, they know full well that this idea that Ukraine intervened in the U.S. election is a joke. And then, of course, the example that's always given is the op-ed, the ill-advised, I have to say, op-ed written by the ambassador at the time criticizing Trump on his comments about Crimea. Well, that's hardly the same. An op-ed in a public newspaper is hardly the same as a centralized, committed effort to subvert the U.S. democratic process by a foreign intelligence agency, which is exactly what happened with Russia.
Exactly. Well, the other part of it, which is a little bit disconcerting, is how some of these senior Republicans do not believe our own intelligence services, which do incredible work to discover what's going on.
It's very concerning, but I do want to point out, I think this is a very small minority of the Republican leadership that shares these conspiracy theories, and I think a lot of it is out of a sense of devotion to President Trump as opposed to any sort of commitment or attempt to whitewash Russia's behavior.
And of course, devotion doesn't last long, particularly once he's out of office. Then,
well, I mean, with this president, we've shown that even while he's in office, you could quickly get under the bus.
Exactly. So. Which also brings us back to what Russia continues to do. They continue to try and interfere in our election process. For sure, they're going to be very active in terms of disinformation, maybe even trying to hack some of our election rolls and election results. I mean, who knows what they have actually planned. Have we done enough to protect ourselves for this year's election?
Well, you hear all the right things coming from the people who need to be saying the right things in terms of Director of National Intelligence, Homeland Security Secretary. You hear all the right things being said. So let's hope that we are better prepared than we were last time. The problem is there are certain aspects about American society that the government cannot do anything about in terms of protecting from Russian interference. Sure. And that's how just divided as a society we are. This is something that we as Americans have to fix. This is why Russia picks certain campaigns and movements to cause divisions, right? You have Russian trolls backing Texas independence movements,
right. Or Californian independence, yeah.
Even gun rights, Second Amendment groups. Russia's backing promoting some of this work on social media. And at the same time, that same Russian troll factory outside St. Petersburg is funding Black Lives Matter campaign on social media, or some LGBT, because these are what divides American society, and Russia knows this, and they take advantage of it. So I think we as Americans have to first come together and figure out how to get along again and understand each other's concerns better. And if we do that, then that will deny Russia this fertile, feeding ground where it can, plant its disinformation. And this is I would say the biggest challenge. But in terms of the U.S. Being more resilient against these sort of attacks from Russia, I don't think Russia really cares if it was I don't think they cared if it was President Trump or President Hillary Clinton in 2016. I think they wanted to sow so much discord that they wanted to show that the U.S. election process is not legitimate. People are questioning it, and in this sense, Russia has succeeded.
Yeah. The Trump victory, in a way, they celebrated as a bonus because the idea was to disrupt the process. So, again, I don't think they have a favored candidate, but I know even within the Democratic Party, they're going to try and create as much division as possible.
Of course, yeah, because they just want to discredit the whole democratic process in the United States.
Yeah, Russia's fighting a different war now. They're not presenting themselves as a better model. They're simply presenting the West as a worse model.
Exactly. Exactly. That's a very good way to put it.
Let me ask you one interesting question. I was reading a recent, I don't know if you saw, a recent Pew Research Center international poll. Let me read it to you. It showed that the majority of people overseas no longer fear America as an unchecked unilateralist superpower, as many did during the George W. Bush administration, but they actually fear a U.S. retreat from global leadership and from promoting democracy and so forth, particularly these European countries, European voters. Has Trump inadvertently made the world realize how important America is? This is a paradox. If they want more U.S. leadership, more U.S. engagement rather than less. I mean, isn't this...
Well, in a way, but a lot of this talk about U.S. retreat from the world, I don't really see it playing out for reasons we already discussed earlier about ending these never-ending wars. But we're still,
But how perceptions.
Perception is definitely reality, especially in international affairs and diplomacy. Certainly on issues like climate change or trade. You can see the U.S. taking a different route from its traditional partners and allies and friends. But on the other stuff, you don't really see it that much. But because of the perception, because this is what, President Trump will go to a campaign rally in Arkansas or Iowa, and he'll say, we're getting out of these wars, we're stopping this, we're doing this, and then the next day, he'll be in the Oval Office signing an order to send more troops to the Middle East.
Yeah, right.
So, but because there's this perception that's been built up that the U.S. is withdrawing and putting up the drawbridge.
And the fear that if we get attacked, America's no longer going to come to our rescue, to our help. I think that's a fear particularly could grow in Central Eastern Europe and amongst other allies.
Yeah, you do see that. However, I think in a way, the killing of Qasem Soleimani might alleviate some of this concern. I think there was probably a concern by some in the Middle East, especially the Gulf states, after Iran attacked the tankers and attacked the facilities in Saudi Arabia, that where's the U.S. here? And then next thing you know, Qasem Soleimani was taken out in a drone strike. And that will send a very powerful message, not only to U.S. adversaries, but also to U.S. allies, that there is still the resolve to do this sort of thing.
Right. And of course, in Central Eastern Europe, it's essential for America to continue to be engaged, which brings us to the Balkans.
Yes.
Let me ask you actually one question. I don't think I've asked you this since he was appointed. Ambassador Grinnell, Richard Grinnell, who's appointed as special envoy for particularly the talks between Kosovo and Serbia. What do you think of that appointment? Is this going to break the deadlock, do you think?
Well, since that appointment, not much has happened, right?
We haven't had a government in Kosovo, is one of the
True,
problems.
that is
And elections are looming in Serbia.
Serbia,
Yeah.
which of course are problems, but there hasn't been, I would expect by now some major keynote speech by him outlining his vision, at least a framework.
Because he's the White House appointee. This is not State Department appointee, right?
But what is positive about this, I mean, Ambassador Grinnell is not exactly known to be very experienced on the issues of the Balkans, but what really matters, especially in this kind of diplomacy, is his direct link to the Oval Office. So whenever he goes to the region and he meets with officials, they know that whatever they say to Grinnell is going to go back to Trump. Right. And whatever Grinnell says probably came from Trump. So that matters a lot in international diplomacy. Right. That's why you often hear people complain about the appointment process of U.S. ambassadors. Someone who gives a lot of money to a campaign, all of a sudden they're ambassador to London. People complain about that, but the government in those countries, they like it because they know that that person's very close to the president. They have the ear of the president. Exactly.
It's not just a bureaucrat.
But I am slightly disappointed by the notwithstanding the political situation in Kosovo and Serbia, I'm disappointed by the lack of initiative, I guess, on Ambassador Grinnell's part to capitalize on what was, with his announcement being kind of big news in the region and big news among people who focus on this policy issue, and not seeing really anything materialize from it.
Well, do you think he should be more outspoken? I mean, first of all, you need two parties that can talk to each other. I mean, the delay in Kosovo in forming a government, it's almost becoming Bosnian-like, which would be tragic.
Belgium-like.
Yeah. So should he be leaning more on Pristina? We want a government. We need to resolve this question.
Well, I don't know if that would be, well, certainly the situation in Kosovo has to be resolved before there can be any meaningful talks. But I'm not sure it's the role of the U.S. Special Representative to be pressuring Kosovo on this issue. In many ways, I think the U.S. government should be perhaps doing this behind the scenes, or Secretary Pompeo or even the White House saying, hey, you guys need to get together and you guys need to unlock this. You need to agree a coalition government and you need to start governing. Right. If the special envoy or special representative does this, then he's injected himself into the domestic politics of Kosovo, but yet he's supposed to be seen as being this impartial broker between Kosovo and Serbia over these issues. So I think it's wise that Grinnell himself has taken this approach at arm's length, this issue at arm's length. But I would have liked to see some sort of major statement or speech or a major op-ed penned by him outlining what his approach is going to be and his motivation behind all of this. I think it would be very helpful. Yeah,
not just vis-a-vis Kosovo, also vis-a-vis Serbia, which of course is also resistant, if you like, to a deal. What do you think of these this question of territorial exchanges? Do you think that's off the table now?
Well, I don't know if it's completely off the table, but I think it would be a terrible idea. I think that the instability or the domino effect of exchanging a few thousand acres of land, it's not worth the risk. And yes, I understand that there are minority groups that live in certain pieces of territory on the other side of the border, but Kosovo and Serbia need to behave like other European countries, which they find a way to respect the rights and treat with dignity and fairness minority groups. Germany does this, France does this, Italy does this. Most European countries have minority groups inside their borders and there are no problems. Sure. So Kosovo and Serbia need to start thinking like this. I wrote a paper actually after Grinnell's appointment where I outlined some of the points that should guide his approach to this issue, his talks with Kosovo and Serbia. And one of them was to be a special envoy and don't be a cartographer. We should not be redrawing borders right now in the Balkans.
I'm sure he reads your material.
Well, let's hope.
With regard to, let's say, Trump policy towards the Balkans, we have, as you mentioned earlier, Montenegro is already a member of the alliance. North Macedonia, sometime this year, will get the official invitation. I mean, Senate has already ratified. Who's next?
Well, I think the ball's in the Europeans' court now, and with President Macron's comments a couple months ago, about EU accession talks, especially with North Macedonia. It's very disappointing. If I was a North Macedonian, they're told by the EU, you change, go through this national humiliation of changing your name.
Right.
And then they basically plug the hole of refugees heading through the Balkans route into Europe.
And they say this will free you to enter the European Union.
And then they don't even get accession talks. We're not even talking about membership. We're just talking about the accession process, the talks beginning. So I'm very pessimistic about this. And from a U.S. point of view, it's in the U.S. interest that these countries become closer to Europe, whether that means through EU membership or through NATO or other Euro-Atlantic organizations or institutions. It's in America's interest that they're aligned this way. But we also have to understand our limitations on what we can practically do to help them along the way. We can be advocates, especially for NATO. But when it comes to NATO membership, we're running out of, we've had some good success in the Balkans. And, the truth is Bosnia isn't quite ready yet. And of course, some people even talk about Serbia, but I think this probably won't happen in my lifetime. One never knows, but take a fundamental shift and take a generational shift in outlook and mentality by Serbia's leaders to see Serbia someday as a full member of NATO. And I'm not sure if this is on the cards. So we'll see what happens.
Well, this administration, in terms of EU membership, let's start with that. The Trump administration has been hesitant about the EU. They've been supportive of, obviously, Brexit. They've been, Grinnell himself has been not, let's say, a major fan of European Union integration enlargement. Do you think we could, this administration maybe is not urging the European Union in the same way as previous administrations in terms of taking in Balkan countries?
Well, I think this approach by the administration on the EU has been, on balance, a positive one. And the reason why I say that, I don't like President Trump's rhetoric about the EU being designed to undermine the U.S. or to take advantage of the U.S. economy. But I do think the White House has a point, and I think many Europeans share this view, that perhaps the EU has integrated politically and economically to its natural limit, at least for now. So instead of trying to find ways to integrate further, maybe they should consolidate where they are and try to improve how the EU delivers for your average European person. And I think this is one of the reasons why Brexit happened. I think this is why we've seen the rise of Eurosceptic parties across much of the European Union. You take a place like Greece, where at one point they had 50% youth unemployment. There are going to be societal consequences to this. People are going to feel left behind, people that have and have-nots, and a lot of this policy was driven by the European Union. However, all of that being said, I think that every country has to ask itself, is membership in the European Union, if the benefits from membership is worth the trade-off in national sovereignty?
There's always costs and benefits.
Yeah. For a country like North Macedonia, of course, the trade-off is worth it. If you're a country like the United Kingdom, I think there's good arguments on both sides. A big country like the UK could probably go it alone without having to give up sovereignty. So I think this administration probably should be a little more nuanced in how it talks about these issues, but I think this general idea that perhaps the EU has integrated too quickly in political and economic affairs and they should take a step back and try to make the union work better, I think is a legitimate one.
Sure. One thing I do fear with the whole, and I think we've seen this already with the whole Brexit thing, is Britain was one of the loudest voices on wider rather than deeper. In other words, bringing in the Central European countries, the Balkan countries. That voice is no longer there. So, so the French can say what Macron has been doing.
But that voice isn't there. But even if it was there, France could, all it takes is one country to block and veto. And the UK liked this idea of wider, not deeper, because it didn't like deeper. It liked the idea of more members, diluted.
But it opened the doors to a lot of countries that may otherwise not have got in.
But I think that the UK will continue to be a European power after it leaves the EU, a continental power. It's been so for hundreds of years in the past. It'll be so for hundreds of years in the future. The example I give is in In 1920, there were British troops in Estonia helping Estonia get their independence.
Right.
That was before the EU existed. 100 years later, after the UK leaves the EU, British troops are in Estonia as part of the Forward Enhanced Presence.
Right.
You know, Britain is a European country, culturally, historically, geographically. It's just decided not to pursue that political relationship with the rest of Europe.
Well, in terms of the NATO alliance, of course, Britain plays a major role, and I think it will continue. In fact, I think Johnson has already said that they're going to recommit themselves in a way to that security.
I could see a situation where, because of the criticism some will give Britain about leaving the European Union, that the Brits will want to make some sort of grand gesture towards European security or European issues. And of course, the Brits have always played a leading role in the Balkans, so I could see them continuing this as well.
Yeah, and hopefully push back on this idea of some sort of separate European army.
Yes.
Which would simply just drain resources from NATO.
Of course. You know, the British have always, they've been the ones that blocked many of these initiatives. On EU defense integration, which is very duplicative and discriminatory against NATO in many ways. And that voice will be gone, but there are many countries in Central and Eastern Europe who don't like this idea either, who understand the importance of NATO, and they don't want to dilute NATO. So they're going to have to step up to the plate and fill that space that Britain used to occupy on this issue.
Right. Last few minutes, Luke, I wanted to rack your brains a little bit on Russia. I mean, you deal a lot with Russia's policies, and what I would say Russia's destructive influences in Central Europe and the Balkans. What more should NATO and the EU, or let's say Europe and America, what more should we be doing to try and limit those negative influences?
Well, a lot of this has to deal with how our societies operate and our economies and our system of governance. As I told you already, the big problem in the U.S. is how divided America is as a society. So Russia is able to take advantage of the situation to cause even further division in different communities. Right. And that's the same with Central and Eastern Europe too. So I think the best thing that NATO can do to win a hybrid war with Russia is not to create the conditions that allow for a hybrid war. And then on the other hand, we need to continue our resolve on our forward enhanced presence, our physical military footprint in the region. We need to be doing more in the Black Sea. We need to start taking things to the next level. Like with Baltic air policing, it probably should become a Baltic air defense mission now. We need to think smartly about how we deal with challenges of energy. Nord Stream 2 is a good example. Not only is Germany in violation of EU law, but just the laws of geopolitics would make any reasonable person think that taking gas from Russia in these circumstances is not a very wise decision to make. So I believe that we have the right idea. We're heading in the right direction. We just have to not become complacent. We have to keep thinking creatively and thinking how to confront what is becoming an ever-changing challenge, because Russia is also adapting. Right.
Russia, of course, faces its own internal stagnation, if not decline. I mean, economic growth is projected at maybe 1%, maybe less. Living standards are falling. There's a lot of public dissatisfaction, particularly in many regions of Russia. But usually those occasions are used by the Russian government to stage some attack on a neighbor in order to mobilize, if you can't give bread, you create circuses, right, for the public. So are we prepared for maybe another, and we've talked about this, a lot of us analysts in Washington, about potential revival of a Russian attack against Ukraine. In other words, taking the entire Azov Sea coastline, completely blocking Ukrainian ports, maybe even starting rebellions across the Transnistrian border into the Odessa district or Transcarpathia. Are we prepared for anything like this?
Well, I hope we are. It's difficult to say because you have no idea what the circumstances will be. But that's why I mentioned about becoming complacent. We should not become complacent and think that everything is going to be fine and okay. We should actually assume and plan that Russia is going to do something like this. Because As you pointed out, when the domestic pressures start mounting on the Kremlin, that's when they start looking for adventurism elsewhere. However, there is also a balance that the Russians have to strike too, because a lot of these overseas adventures, especially in Syria, are starting to become very costly.
Right.
So they have to. That's why we have to be creative with our responses, because I suspect Russia's going to be creative with what they do.
They don't want to overstretch and
Exactly.
then find themselves completely vulnerable. One other question actually on Russia, and has been a lot of focus on this in recent months, is the future of Belarus. As you know, Putin's term expires officially in a couple of years. Is he going to want to annex Belarus? I know he's been pushing Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, into creating some sort of tighter union. Again, are we prepared for potential forcible annexation of Belarus?
Well, actually, one thing the Trump administration has done is they've kind of slowly and very incrementally put Belarus back on the Russian map. You know, Bolton went out there. Just the fact that Bolton went to Belarus must have probably drove the Russians crazy, just by his appearance in Minsk.
We're opening an embassy, and
we're kind of thawing out the diplomatic relations. There are even some articles that are being flown around, commentators out there, about oil exports and this sort of thing. Even if it doesn't come to fruition, that alone will knock Russia off balance a little bit. And of course, Pompeo is due to visit, I believe, soon. I think as part of a larger trip.
Right.
So I think it's good that the U.S. is, looking at this issue and focusing on this. I think we have to be realistic on how much we can influence what happens in Belarus. And we should also assume that Putin's #1 goal every single day is regime preservation. And we should
his
assume
own regime,
his personal preservation. And we should assume that he'll take measures, regardless how drastic, to ensure his continued rule. And of course, one of the theories being floated around, as you alluded to, is this idea of a union between Belarus and Russia, which would create a new constitution, which would offer the drafter of this new constitution an opportunity to change or get rid of term limits.
Right, so he can stay in office even longer than Stalin.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I mean, this, of course, if anything happens in Belarus, major Russian military intervention or absorption, this immediately affects key NATO allies, Poland.
Yeah, of course.
Right on the border.
Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, even though it's not a NATO member, still very close to NATO, and NATO's watching very closely what's happening there.
Luke, on that note, I think we've run out of time. Watch this space. Love to have you back soon. Thank you so much.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
And let you know when we're broadcasting.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much. We'll take a little break now. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at RTK and at VOA. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshim.